Good morning, beautiful people. It is great to be with you all today. Hope that you're all doing well. Let's read our text this morning, Mark chapter 12, verse 17. Let's read it together. Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. This is a picture of tri-state peaks. You've got Kentucky, I believe Virginia, and if I remember correctly, Tennessee, all in one spot. And I've stood right there. So it is possible to be in not one, not two, but three places at one time. I'm told Four Corners is the same, but I haven't yet met it there. And I find this imagery somewhat interesting. Yeah, Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky. I find this imagery somewhat interesting because of, I think, how it relates to the challenge of Christianity. And that is here at Tri-State Peaks, you have the opportunity to be in more than one place at one particular point in time. Same thing at Four Corners. The same thing of many of the tri-state areas. I think there's something like 36 throughout the United States. And the challenge of Christianity is that we're asked to stand in two places at one time. We're asked to stand both in the kingdom of heaven, for we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and we're told that we're citizens now in the kingdom of heaven for those of us who've accepted Christ. But we're also told that we live here in this world. That's why the summary of what Jesus will pray for his disciples, that they not be taken out of this world, is often summarized that we are to be in this world, but not of it. That we're to exist within this world, that we're to live within this world, that we have responsibilities to one another within this world, and yet we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven all at the same time. That is, that we live in two places at once. So how do we do that? For admittedly, it comes with numerous challenges as we try to be citizens of one kingdom and citizens of another kingdom all at one time. And Jesus, in the text we read just a moment ago, is going to express one of those challenges, to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God's what is God. The challenge of living in one country as well as living as citizens of the kingdom of heaven all at one time. And today we're going to look at it. But as we do and as we explore the implications for our Christian life, it'll be important that we remember that this is a challenge to apply this, that Jesus is going to present a principle. There are commands and principles within Scripture. Commands usually address one specific instance, and then there's a principle associated with that command that can be applied to other instances as well. And we're not explicitly told exactly how to apply this particular command at every single possible situation we could come up with. So there's an element of grace needed for one another as we try to apply this command to all the different situations that could possibly emerge. Let's read our text together, verses 13 through 7. Actually, I know it says verse 13, but for context, I want us to back up to verse 12. Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. And I'm wondering, how many Bibles do we have? How many Bibles are there? What a great sight. Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 12. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." And they brought him one and said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. For context, you might remember last week we talked about Jesus and the cleansing of the temple. That he has come into the temple. God incarnate has come into the place where his name has been worshipped, the name where he caused his place to dwell. God incarnate has finally arrived and seen that his house has been turned not into a house of prayer, but from a house of prayer into what he would describe as a den of thieves. And he overturns the money changing tables, and he casts out all of the animals that are there in the court of the Gentiles and runs them out of the temple. Well, it didn't go over that well with the Jewish leaders. For at the end of that text in chapter 11, it talks about how they wanted to destroy him, but they feared for the people. So they've just been trying to figure out how is it that they can destroy Jesus? How can they trap him? What is it that they could possibly do out of their anger and frustration with the chaos that he has caused? And they arrive at this question, a question that they believe will trap Jesus because he'll have nowhere to turn. And I want you to notice who comes and asks him, beginning in verse 13. And they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. Now to you and me, that might not mean anything at all. But had you been a first century individual, the idea of the Pharisees and the Herodians being in the same place at the same time, working together for anything, would have been preposterous. It was about as far on the political spectrum as you could possibly get. For the Pharisees were of the opinion that they should throw out the Romans, that they should overthrow the Romans and want nothing to do with them. The Herodians, however, were of the opinion that the Romans aren't so bad, that we should, if not fully embrace, that we should at least be okay with their presence here because they followed Herod, who was a puppet king associated with the Romans. So they were individuals as far on the political spectrum as they could possibly get, and yet they are somehow united in their hatred of Jesus, and they come to ask him a question. And it's a doozy. And their question goes like this. Should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Now, on the surface, it sounds like a fairly simple question, but it's loaded with theological conundrums. For Caesar, at this particular point in time, believes himself, or at least claims to be God. In fact, there is a emperor worship cult that exists in Rome at this particular point in time that would at times make sacrifices to and worship Caesar because he was understood to be, if not a god directly himself, at least right on the same general level and one who should be understood as one of the gods, one of the individuals appointed by the gods themselves. So he was understood by Roman culture to be declared to be deity, at least in some form. So really the question is a little bit deeper of not just should we pay taxes, but should we pay taxes to an individual who declares himself to be God when Israel was to have no other gods before me? That's really the question they're asking. Is it okay for us to pay taxes to one who declares himself to be God when we are to have no other gods before us? Now, should Jesus say, no, we shouldn't pay taxes? Then he endangers himself with the Romans. It could perhaps be labeled, in fact likely will be labeled, a seditionist, at which point the Romans will gladly take care of him and he will be removed from the Jews as a problem. Should he say yes, that we should pay taxes, now he's going to lose some level of popular opinion because those who are around him understood him to be the Messiah and understood that that meant that he would overthrow the Romans or at least be a burr in their saddle. And perhaps he could be open to the accusation of blasphemy for he would have said it was okay to pay taxes to one who had declared himself to be God. So if he says yes, he's in trouble. If he says no, he's in trouble. That leaves one option, and that is to do nothing, to say nothing, to do exactly what the Pharisees had done when Jesus asked him a question, or asked them a question. For he has asked them, John's baptism, was it from man or from God? And they said, we don't know, because they knew they couldn't say yes. They knew they couldn't say no. So the only path forward for Jesus in this question of paying taxes is, well, I don't know. But notice how they set up this particular question. And they came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion. For you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Can you hear the sarcasm dripping from their voice as they set up their question? For he can't say no. He can't say yes. That leaves, I don't know. But if he says, I don't know, now he's lost the people's opinion of him. Because they just set it up of you're not swayed by anybody's opinion. So if he says, I don't know, then, well, clearly he is swayed by somebody's opinion. And he's not the teacher they thought they were. So in their mind, they have Jesus fully trapped. He can't say yes. He can't say no. He can't say, I don't know. There's no way out of this trap that they have so eloquently, so wisely laid before him. Notice Jesus' response. But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one and said to him, whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at him. It was a magnificent response to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In ancient times, this is what a denarius looks like. Specifically, the tax they're talking about is not just a general tax. It's a tax associated with living. For the Romans levied a tax on everyone just for breathing. If you were to breathe, you had to pay this tax. And it can only be paid with this particular denarius, this particular type of currency. And you'll notice that this particular picture is that of Caesar. It's important. For an ancient culture, the understanding was the image that the currency bore was the one to whom that currency belonged. Anything that bore the image of someone else belonged to the individual whose image was upon it. So what Jesus says here is render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, because it's already his. You recognize it as already being his, so just give him the things that belong to him. In making that statement, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, Jesus acknowledges the legitimacy of government. Now, he's not the only one in this text who recognizes the reality of that statement. For notice how Jesus sets up his response. Verse 15, but knowing their hypocrisy. You might remember that hypocrisy is the idea of being two-faced, of saying one thing whenever you mean something else. Having two faces. It comes from the idea of being an actor, where you might put on one face and you got another face and you got another face, that kind of idea. But knowing their hypocrisy, so being two-faced, saying one thing but meaning something else, but knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought him one. Notice the word they. Who is the they that brought him the denarius? Well, it's the people who asked him the question. They came, they asked him the question, they give him a denarius. Where did they get it from? They brought him a denarius from amongst themselves. Somebody reached into their pocket and pulled out a coin. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Tim Hawkins, but Tim Hawkins is a comedian, and one of my favorite sticks that he does is things you don't say to your wife. You don't tell her, hey, I bought you a treadmill for your birthday. That's not a good place to start. You don't say, hey, you remember that video we had of our wedding? Well, I ran out of VHS tapes, and so I taped over it with a ball game. Don't do that. There are things you don't say to your wife. There are moments and times where we open our mouth to speak, and we immediately stick our foot and cram it all the way in there. In my mind's eye, Jesus asks for a denarius. Somebody reaches into their pocket, pulls it out, and everyone of that group looks and just goes, oh no. And if he could have taken that back, I'm certain that the guy who reaches in his pocket forever would have thought, if I could have just put my foot in my mouth. Because he takes a coin that he has and pulls it out. He says, I'm okay with using this coin because I'm utilizing it as currency. Even though I and everyone else recognizing it as belonging to Caesar because it has Caesar's picture on it, I recognize it as a legitimate form of currency that legitimately belongs to the Roman government. I am okay with using what they've given me. So they too acknowledged the legitimacy of the government that was there. Jesus just points out that you too recognize it. To render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God's what is God's. That Jesus expects his disciples, as we exist in two kingdoms, to obey and recognize the authority of government. It's something that Paul will reiterate in Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, I'm curious. Why do you think Jesus doesn't say, render to Caesar the taxes that are Caesar's? Why does he not say that? Because the discussion is about taxes and about money. Instead, he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. So why not limit it to merely the taxes the discussion is about? Why extend it beyond that? Unless, of course, there was something more that we owe government than just simply our taxes. Romans seems to build upon that, the idea of submission. Now, if we went around the room today and I asked everyone to give me a definition of submission, we would get a variety of responses, but at least some of them would be in the same vein as the word we most often hear with regard to submission, and that is subjugation. Subjugation is the idea of you're going to do what I told you to. Submission is the choice to yield. Now, you know what it is. Well, maybe not. As you're driving along and as you come across that upside down triangle with red, what does it mean? That's about what I thought, because as I drive around, nobody else seems to know what it is either. It means to slow down. It means to yield. It might even mean to stop, depending upon what the other traffic is doing, right? That idea of yielding, of I'm going to choose to let you go ahead. I'm going to choose to do what you asked me to do. Subjugation, I can't yield because I'm being forced to. Submission is the idea of I'm choosing to yield to you. And this is what Jesus talks about. The choice to yield and to do what government has asked us to do. That always seems to bring up at least two questions. One is, well, why government? Why would we need it? If you're familiar with the book of Judges, you might recognize a cycle that seems to take place. It is summarized best towards the end of the book. There's a repeated phrase. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I want you to imagine with me for a minute. I want you to put on your imagination cap and imagine with me for just a minute. What would it look like if everyone did what was right in his own eyes? There were no agreed upon consequences. I hesitate to say there were no consequences because if I did something to you, you would do something to me. So there would be an element of consequence. But there would be no agreed upon consequence. Everyone could do whatever they wanted, whatever seemed right to them in the moment, and there was no real agreed upon, we're not going to do this. What would the world look like? It would be utter chaos. Because I'm fairly certain we're not all going to agree at any point in time as to exactly what the right thing to do would be. And that's the picture that we get in the book of Judges. It's this cycle of Israel will do evil and God will have to punish them and then save them. Israel will do evil, God will have to save them. And there's this cycle that seems to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse until the end of the book of Judges, where Israel looks exactly like the Canaanites that they were never supposed to look like. But the idea of the purpose of government is to kind of curtail evil, to make it a little harder for evil to expound, because evil seems to grow in the midst of chaos. The more chaos there is, the more evil seems to be able to grow. And the more evil there is, the more chaos seems to be able to grow. It seems to be this vicious cycle. So the point of government seems to be to try to limit the amount of chaos or to limit the extrapolation of chaos. Now that always leads to another question. What about bad government? What do you do when, or how are we as Christians supposed to react, when government is bad, or at least when we perceive it to be bad? When Jesus makes this statement, when Paul makes this statement, when Jesus says to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, do you know who's on the throne? At least the throne of Rome. Nero. Nero was not a Christian-loving individual. You might remember him from the fires of Rome that he sets and blames on the Christians. It wasn't the only thing he set on fire. He would occasionally light his racetrack. And you know what he used for kindling? Humans, specifically Christians. He would light his racetrack by setting Christians on fire and then running his horses around. This is the individual who is on the throne at the point in time when Jesus makes this statement, when Paul makes his statement in Rome. Jesus will refer to the Jewish leaders who sit in Moses' seat. The very individuals who are asking him this question, the very individuals who will orchestrate his crucifixion. And he will tell his disciples to respect and to honor those who sit in Moses' seat. To don't be like them, but to respect and honor them because they sit in Moses' seat. He will instruct his disciples to submit to the governing authorities that were there, even though those governing authorities were going to kill him. Even though those governmental authorities are the ones he's criticizing, the ones trying to trap him, he would still say that there was to be submission there. It seems that as Christians, as we live within this particular kingdom, that we're still supposed to submit to the governing authorities, whether we agree with them or not. But that's not the end of Jesus' statement. He said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. For we don't just live in one kingdom as Christians, we live in two kingdoms. The kingdom here on earth, but also the kingdom that is in heaven. Jesus here is going to build upon the idea of image. For you might remember in Genesis chapter 1, God creates the male and female. In the image of God, he created them. That just as the currency and the image that was there was to indicate ownership of who owned that currency, in this case Caesar, so our bearing of the image of God also indicates who it is that owns us, who it is that we answer to, who it is that is the creator of this universe and all things within it, including us, and that is the one whose image we bear, that is God. Not only are we to render to Caesar what is Caesar, but also to God what is God's. Now, I find it interesting, Jesus does not say render taxes to Caesar and tithes to God, even though the conversation is revolving around money and taxes. So why does he not do that? Well, just as more was owed government than merely taxes, so more is owed God than merely tithes, than merely our money. In James 1, we read the following. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Every good and perfect gift, that everything we have comes from God. Go ahead and read this text with me, please. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Notice that God sends rain on just and unjust. Not only do all things that we have belong to him, but the rain that we enjoy, the rain that allows things to grow, comes from him. In Acts 17, go ahead and read this text with me too. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by human, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Notice that it points out not only does God need nothing from us, but that everything, even the breath that we have, comes from him, that all things that we have are from him. And in Philippians chapter 2, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. That all things that we have, the breath that we enjoy, that they all come from God. Even our salvation comes from God. There's nothing that we have that is not from him, that has not been given by him. It was all from him. All belongs to him and has all been entrusted to us. So what are we to do? What are we to do to one who's given us all things? How are we to react to one who we wouldn't breathe without his say-so? How do we react to one who's given us salvation and the idea of eternal life, not only life now, but life into eternity? What could we possibly give? How could we possibly recognize what a magnificent gift that we've been entrusted with? The only thing I can think of is the idea of gratitude. For the only thing we can really offer someone to whom we can't really give anything, who doesn't need anything from us, the only way to show our appreciation for he who has given us all things and whose image we are created is the idea of gratitude. It's what Paul will say when he talks about to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. Not just one sacrifice, but a continual, daily, minutely sacrifice that we are to give to him. For we're not simply to exist in one kingdom, but in both kingdoms. And that brings up a conundrum. For Jesus will talk about in Matthew, no one can serve two masters. He will either hate the one or love the other. What it means is that we always make a choice. There is always a choice as to what is most important. Even when we try and have two things that are most important, we will always pick one or the other, either intentionally or unintentionally. There will only ever be one most important thing. So if we live in two kingdoms, we will always have to make a choice at some particular point in time, because at some point those kingdoms are likely to clash. And so we end up making a choice as to which is the most important kingdom in which we live. For we exist in both, but they can't both be most important. So when kingdoms clash, when the world we live in clashes with the eternal world that we are beginning to live in, what are we to do? The first is to honor God in all things. I thought about honor God in all political discussions, but I needed the space. Or honor God in all things before this one, but I needed the space. The most important is to honor God, because we have to decide what is most important. And everything else that we're going to talk about has to be filtered through that lens of he has to be the first and primary, ultimate choice through which we will view everything else. He has to be our primary, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be there. No, it won't be. I'll get to it. He has to be our first and foremost primary responsibility that we look through, including how we talk in terms of politics. I've heard very well-meaning individuals, perhaps even well-meaning Christians, who the way that they have discussed politicals or political figure, political ideas or political ideologies, that it might make you question where their primary allegiance is. For if all that someone else knew of our Christianity was the way in which we talk about politics, the way in which we talk about political figures who we might disagree with, maybe even political figures that are on the complete opposite aisle of what we happen to be, what conclusion would they arrive at as to where our primary citizenship is based on our speech within the political realm? I've heard some who would pull in, well, that political figure looks like this. Why? What was the benefit of that? Or that political figure, who would want to be married to that? Really? Because that's loving and kind. How would we, more appropriately, how would those who hear us speak about politics, what would they arrive at as our primary focus of our citizenship? Where would they assume our primary citizenship is based upon the way that we have political discussions? The way in which we honor God in the obedience of laws. And not only are we to obey government, remember we're supposed to submit to government, but we're supposed to submit to God first and foremost. And there are examples all throughout Scripture. There are moments in time where individuals had to choose how they were going to follow God when the world in which they lived and the God whom they served, when the two clashed. Perhaps the best example comes from Daniel. Now, you might remember that Daniel is told he cannot pray anymore to his God. Admittedly, it's a trap, but nevertheless, the king signs into law, no one can pray to anyone except for him. And you remember what Daniel does. He goes up to his room and prays just as he always has. That phrase, just as he always has, is important for two reasons. One, it means that he didn't cease to do what he knew God had asked him to do. He didn't cease to obey God and to follow God, didn't allow his relationship with God to be compromised because of what government said, that we're always to obey God first. But he also did as he always had. He didn't add anything to it. He didn't do anything to draw unnecessary attention to himself. He didn't do anything just to raise a rebellious flag. He just simply did as he had always done. That, yes, we're to submit to government. But when the two clash, we're to obey God first. But we're still supposed to, as we obey God first, what areas can I still submit in? In Daniel's case, they told him don't pray. Well, he couldn't submit there, he had to pray. But that didn't mean that he had to go out on a street corner. That didn't mean that he had to throw up big giant signs. That didn't mean that he had to tell everybody else around him. That didn't, you get the idea. It didn't mean a whole bunch of other things. And it didn't mean that he said, well, I can't submit in any other area because you've said don't do this. He said, well, I have to do this because my allegiance to God is first. But I'm still to submit to government in other arenas. So we honor God in the way that we obey him first and foremost as we continue to submit to government. And then thirdly, we honor God in our engagement with other Christians. For if we are the church that God would have us to be, that would mean that we would want all people to come join us. Republican, Democrat, Independent, all ethnicities, all backgrounds, which means we're not going to agree on everything. And it's quite possible that even in the political realm we might disagree. And that's okay. For Jesus will say, love one another as I have loved you. When he makes that statement in John 13, do you know who's in the room with him? Some smart aleck's going to say his disciples. Yes, you're right. Good job. But there's also Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the zealot. If you don't know what those two words mean, a tax collector was employed by the Romans. From the Jewish perspective, he had become Benedict Arnold and turned his back on his people. A zealot hated the Romans and lived for one purpose, and that was to kill as many Romans and as many of those associated with Rome as he possibly could. So a tax collector, Benedict Arnold, and one who was sworn to kill all of Benedict Arnold were in the same room when Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. And it seems like they were able to do it. Where they're part of his disciples, that all individuals are able to become one in Christ, provided that they're seeking him first. And the way in which we treat one another, the way in which we love one another, even when we disagree, is to be filtered through what country, what land, what citizenship do we have as first and foremost? For there are a lot of things that might try and separate us, but the one who unites us is greater than anything that might divide us. And when kingdoms clash, we're to remember that we are united not only here in this life because of what Christ has done for us, but we're united even into eternity. And that has to take priority. It's no secret that I love Star Wars. If it was a secret to you, see my office. And there's two characters in Star Wars who just seem to be a package deal. They're always together, Chewbacca and Han Solo. And one of the questions that you kind of have to ask is, why does Chewbacca hang around? Because Han Solo is not the brightest crayon in the box. And yet, Chewbacca just keeps seeming to hang around and is always there. The two just seem to always be in tandem. Those familiar with the backstory will remember that Chewbacca owes Han Solo what's called a life debt. It's a literature term that seems to emerge in stories every once in a while of a life debt. It's the idea that someone has done something so great for you that you say, I will live my life for that individual because it's the only way I could ever repay how great, how magnificent of the thing they've done for me. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices. It sounds an awful lot like a life debt to me. That all things we have are from God. Our salvation that he's given us is from God, which means we owe him a life debt, and everything that we do should be focused upon him and his kingdom first and foremost. Which is why we choose to submit to government, because he asked us to. And which is why we keep his kingdom as foremost in our mind, even as we do submit to government, because his kingdom is most important. For we owe him a life debt. And as we render to Caesar what is Caesar's, we're most importantly to render to God what is God's. Perhaps you're here today and you want to begin a relationship with the one who loves you most, the one who sacrificed everything that you might have a relationship with him. And that starts at baptism. Or perhaps you're here today and you just need the prayers of the church. If there's any way we can assist you, won't you come as together we stand and sing.